Hi, everyone. Welcome to a brand new season of Dogs Unknown. It's been a minute, but we're excited to be back with you. And we thought we'd tackle a bit of a complex topic today, sort of a little contentious, and maybe fitting to how how I would say a fair number of people are feeling right now, given the state of things all around us. You know, anxiety levels might be a little bit extra high. So what we're talking about today is the relationship between owner personality traits and dog behavior. We're going to look at existing research and look at if, how, and to what degree, and I think that's the really important part, owner personality might impact the likelihood of a dog displaying behavior issues like fear, anxiety, or aggression. Sound good?
Sounds really good.
Good. It's something we get asked a lot by clients.
Yeah.
I think it's something that most people who have a dog with fear, anxiety, or aggression issues have wondered or have worried about, whether their personality is to blame for their dog's unwanted behavior, right? Is this my fault? I'm anxious and I've created this anxious dog, even if they rescued the dog like 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I would say too, like I would say more people than not who come to see us are worried that we're going to judge them or think negatively of them because their dog has these issues. And I can understand that. You know, you read any comment section on, any sort of dog training video or dog video out there, and it's understandable. But yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than what you're reading.
For sure. And I will say, like, it's not bananas to think there may be some connection.
No.
Right? Like it's an intuitive thing to maybe think, because there also are it's natural to assume that our personality traits would have some influence on our dogs because we have a social relationship with them. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of research on the human side of interpersonal relationships, like human to human, where, things like traits like neuroticism and high levels of anxiety can actually have a pretty negative impact on our relationships with other people. So things like, just to name a few, there's studies that say like humans who score higher in neuroticism, which is kind of just like an old-fashioned term for anxiety. I'm using it because it's used in the research, but please know I don't walk around calling people neurotic. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
I feel like I'm in like the 1950s.
I know, you have a case of the nerves. So I apologize for the terminology, but we're going with what's in the research so as to not, we're just going with what's in the research. I'll just leave it at that. But people who score higher in traits like neuroticism have trouble maintaining friendships. They have a smaller number of friends than people who are not so neurotic. They have difficulty sustaining healthy, happy marriages, romantic partnerships. It pains me to even say stuff like this out loud because I know, for decades past, mothers got blamed for everything that ever would be wrong with their kids growing up. But mothers who ranked higher on neuroticism were shown to have kids who were more likely to display things like anxiety and depression and certain behavior issues. I'm just quoting the research, right? So, and I'm quoting it to say it's not silly for us to wonder, hey, are my own personality traits maybe having a negative impact on my dog?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's fair too, because we're a huge piece of the environment around our dogs as well. So we're in their social group, we're in their environment, and they're highly socially intelligent as well. Yeah. With us. So I think it's,
we're not two ships passing in the night.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. So, but all that said, dogs aren't people. We do have really close personal relationships, but also dogs have been selected to be really adaptive to and accepting of a very wide range of human behaviors, right? If there ever was a being that was take us as we are and love us for it, and I think they do, but there could maybe be an argument that maybe that stuff rolls off dogs' backs a little bit more. I don't know. Well, I do because I already read the research, but right. But it's it would be a question to ask. Today we're going to look at, it's still a relatively small body of research, but it's not a study. So we're going to look at 5 studies that look at potential connections between owner personality traits and dog behavior. And then, so we'll kind of walk through what the findings are, and then we'll regroup and look at what does this actually mean for us as dog owners. So 5 studies that looked at personality traits specifically. There are other studies that look at things like owner demographics, like age, gender, experience owning dogs, income level, education level, all that kind of stuff. And also owner behaviors, like what training methods have you chosen, like blah, 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 all that stuff, and how they relate to dog behavior outcomes. And it's all really interesting, but it's also a big piece to wrap your arms around. So today we're focusing on studies that looked at owner personality dimensions, things like neuroticism, conscientiousness, things like that. And also owner anxiety and depression levels, because those are all sort of could be potentially considered interconnected. So study number 1 looked at associations between owner personality and the prevalence of dog behavior problems. And this is a pretty classic study on this area. It's by Dodman et al. It was published in 2018. And it looked at the relationship between owner personality traits, depression, emotional regulation, training techniques, and dog behavior. We're not going to talk about the training techniques piece of the results today, but it's in there. They used like a standardized questionnaire to measure personality traits and dog behavior. I won't tell you what those scales are, but we can link to a blog article afterwards that lists all that stuff in there and also lists links to the studies. It was a good sample size. It was more than 1,500 current dog owners. And the results were significant. They found that high neuroticism in owners was associated with increased owner-directed aggression and stranger-directed fear. Which interesting, right? Like not increased stranger-directed aggression, increased owner-directed aggression, and stranger-directed fear. Low levels of conscientiousness and low levels of extroversion were also associated with higher rates of stranger-directed fear. Interesting. So that's study 1. Do you have any initial reactions to that, or you want to save them up?
I'll save them up.
Okay. Study 2 also looked at whether owner psychological characteristics can predict dog behavior traits. This was by Clark and Loftus. It was published actually in 2023. If I remember correctly, this may have still been in like the peer review stage. It was like an early thesis or doctorate manuscript. We'll check and put it in the notes after. But so this one looked at the measures used were also standardized questionnaires, a lot of similar ones from before. But multiple studies are important because one study truly tells you nothing except, oh, that's an interesting thing to look into further. Yep. Right? They included almost 500 dog owners, just shy of that, so 497, and also had significant results. So owners with higher levels of anxiety and depression had dogs with increased levels of attention-seeking behavior, separation-related behavior, stranger-directed aggression this time, and fear. Non-social fear, which would be like fear of objects and stuff like that. Dog-directed fear, touch sensitivity, and excitability. So they measured a lot of stuff. Yeah, it is. But I think sort of the ones to highlight there are the increased levels of attention-seeking behavior, separation-related behavior, and then stranger-directed aggression and fear, I would say, are, the highlights there to me.
Yeah.
All right. So we have 2 so far with significant results, tying owner traits to less than desirable behaviors, or the prevalence of less than desirable behaviors, I would say. Study 3 looked at dogs' sociability levels and owners' neuroticism and attachment style to pets as predictors of dog aggression. So this is Gabo and Zupan. I'm going to say, I apologize to you authors. Like, your studies are wonderful. I don't know you personally, and I do not know how to pronounce your names, but we're doing the best we can. This was published in 2020. And yeah, I looked at the relationship between owner neuroticism and attachment style and dogs' behavior and sociability. So again, standardized questionnaires was the measurement route. Most of these are all validated, and yes, there are drawbacks to not actually eyes on looking at dogs and people, and also standardized and validated questionnaires are a really great way to gather data and collect research and do findings. This was a smaller study, 40 dog owner pairs, and they were separated into 3 groups: non-aggressive dogs, dogs aggressive towards humans, and dogs aggressive towards other animals. Okay. And there were some significant results here too. Owners with higher levels of neuroticism had dogs who displayed higher levels of aggression towards humans, more stranger-directed aggression, and more owner-directed aggression. Oh, I see. I'm going to reread that again. Just making my way through my notes. So this one had significant results too. Owners with higher levels of neuroticism had dogs who displayed higher levels of aggression towards both owners and strangers. Okay. More Oh, yes. And then owners with higher avoidant attachment styles, higher avoidant attachment scores, I guess you would say, had dogs with higher levels of owner-directed aggression. So I know this is all like, but I think it's important to just even quickly review what the actual findings are so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. Study number 4 looked at aggressive behavior in English Cocker Spaniels specifically and the personality of their owners. And standardized questionnaires again. This was 285 owners of English Cocker Spaniels. And they were classified into 2 groups. This was based on a previous study that the authors had conducted with the owners before. And those were dogs low in aggressiveness and high in aggressiveness. Okay. So owners with the high aggression dogs were significantly more likely to have higher levels of neuroticism and lower levels of conscientiousness, similar to the first study with Dodman findings. Study number 5 looked at the effects of owner personality on the behavior of, this is a little bit different, on the behavior of actually how the owner and dog interacted with each other. So this one actually used standardized assessments, but also some in-person experiments, which is kind of neat. This was Keese et al. And that was published in 2012. Like I said, this is the only one that looked at like actual observable owner behaviors and had an in-person kind of component to the study. It included 78 dog and owner pairs. And what they found, significant results, is that owners with higher levels of neuroticism used more cues and commands and gave more hand signals when they were trying to get their dogs to perform a simple obedience task like a sit or something. They also had dogs who took longer to perform the sit command. And then they also looked and they found owners with higher levels of extroversion praised their dogs more often and had dogs who spent more time looking at them. So interesting. So those are the 5 studies that we kind of can sum up today. And, you know, long story short, there seems to be some sort of significant, in quotes, because I know not everyone's super familiar with academic research, but there's some sort of significant connection between certain owner personality traits and a prevalence of certain dog behavior issues and how, you know, dogs even respond, like at what level they even respond to their owners. So do you have initial thoughts about that?
Well, I think just to clarify for everyone, because I know some people might think, well, if I have a dog who's aggressive, maybe I'm more stressed or more likely to have anxiety. Maybe that can even trigger depression. You know, I think with the big 5 and those personality traits, those are probably, those are supposed to be more stable over time. So those are supposed to be like less likely to be impacted by current things going on. But I think that that's one important thing. I'm sure that people are thinking about that right now. It's
For
like,
sure.
Like I felt fine until I had my least reactive dog in the middle of the city. You know?
Yep. And I will say, I'm actually scrolling through my pages and pages of notes right now. I will say that actually is specifically addressed in at least one of the dog studies, but it's also brought up a lot in the human literature about these being stable traits. Say like if someone looks at behavior of a partner and how that's impacted by like another partner who's highly neurotic or something like that, and they'll look at like in that relationship versus not. Do you know what I mean? Like the person who's in the relationship with the neurotic partner and how like their personality traits are actually really quite stable depending on circumstance. I'd love to scroll through and find that exact, but I think it's a great point to bring up. Like this is not measuring mood.
Exactly. I think that's like a really important
thing,
right? That it's not measuring mood and personality traits, again, are supposed to be stable over time. I would say maybe the only difference there is when I hear anxiety and depression, I do suspect that can be brought on by really stressful. Well, we know that can be brought on by really stressful situations. So anyways, but just to clarify, there's a little mix of both, but a lot of these we're looking at those big 5 personality traits, which we know have been researched over and over again and tend to be stable over time. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really good, really, really good point to flag for people. Yeah. And then I think, you know, it's interesting, like the one that really jumps out at me actually, and I know we're talking a lot about aggression and things, but it was actually the attention-seeking behavior.
Yeah.
Because, you know, working with, you know, the thousands of dogs that we've worked with, when we get dogs who are highly attention-seeking, I tend to notice that those owners tend to be more stressed. And it's interesting, the other point that you had, which was they give more commands and more cues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I think I've seen as well anecdotally.
Yeah.
And from the dog's perspective, it's almost like they can get overloaded. It's like too much. It's like so much stimuli coming in,
Yeah.
or so much information coming in that they're being told all the time, and they almost end up like tuning their owner out.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that people think we're more extroverted. Their dogs look at them more. Is that what you
They
said?
give more praise and their dogs offer them more attention.
More attention. So there's like, I think there's more negative feedback a lot of times.
Right.
So like, one is like there's so much feedback coming in, so it's like they're like, well, this isn't always important, and when it is coming in, it tends to be more negative.
Right.
So again, that's not everyone. If you have an anxious dog, it doesn't mean that you're doing that, but it is something that I've noticed. And the nice thing about that is, like, when that is happening, there's usually like really low hanging fruit there.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of moving that forward, in terms of like, we always talk about the vow of silence, or, we do different things to sort of bring down how much communication they're getting, bringing more calm to the communication. And that can go like such a long way. So even if you're someone and you're like, oh, I do talk to my dog a lot, I am anxious about their behavior. And a lot of times it's fair too, because,
Right.
If you have a dog who's lunging and barking, like you're trying to make it better for you, for them and for your community and everything. So again, it's not a blame thing. But there is a consequence and an impact when that constant feedback is being given.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And I think, even so, researchers came up with lovely study ideas, published the findings, but even for them, like when it comes to actually explaining why and how there's a connection here, like they don't know.
No,
we don't know. And they say as much, right? Like they only can hypothesize at potential reasons. And I did think it would be interesting to add on to what you just said. I did pull a few quotes, like direct quotes from the different authors about their kind of like potential reasonings and ideas. And then maybe we can react to those and see like how they land with us and how, whether we agree or disagree. So Gabo and Zupan, the 2020 study, they said perhaps, right? They're not saying for sure, but they said perhaps neurotic owners can affect their pet's behavior by being less warm and overall displaying more unpredictable styles of caretaking that result in higher levels of stress and decreased social control for the dog.
Yes.
Right. So like, there's no way for me to control the outcome here because I get different responses based on doing the same behavior. For me, that lands
so much
really well. And even not like, I guess the less warm part, but truthfully, the unpredictable part.
That's the big one that jumps out at me because we see that over and over again, how much predictability matters.
Yeah. And if you're being outright hostile, like, sure.
Right.
But I would say for me, the predictable piece is a big one.
I would say the vast majority of owners we work with, they're not hostile to their dogs at all.
No.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they're actually trying their best, but yes, it is very unpredictable. And if you think about that for even humans, like if you have a boss who's unpredictable, or a partner who's unpredictable, like the amount of the stress that comes with that, because you don't know what's going to happen. So I think that's that really lands with me for sure.
Yeah, same. So Dodman, that's the 2018 sort of I won't say landmark, but kind of like that one to me is one of the most well-known and far-reaching and a great big sample size. They said previous studies have also found that neurotic, emotionally unstable dog owners are more likely to report having dogs with owner-directed aggression problems. I'm reading this just because it might be an indication of these dogs' greater willingness to assert themselves aggressively in competitive interactions with their more anxious owners.
Right.
And I think the sort of I would react to with that is I don't even know it's a willingness to assert themselves like, ooh, here's my opening.
Exactly.
It's a like, somebody needs to step into this role. Like who's in charge?
Yep.
That can be predictable. And like, you seem not to be, even though I love you. Right. Like, and so for me, it almost cycles back to it's someone who's acting emotionally unpredictable, right? The predictability piece comes in again because they pull out the like emotionally unstable sort of piece. I don't know. I thought it was interesting they called that out.
Well, and I think it's also too, I think it's an effort by a lot of dogs to make things predictable.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what I was trying to say very clumsily.
Like, and it's like, it's like, and it is like, it's not like trying to take control of the world but it's like it's trying to have some sort of control over the situation.
Yeah. They're trying to make their world more predictable.
100%.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, and we see that too. Like, and So,
and they echo out and they go on and say again, and people with low conscientiousness scores who often see themselves as kind of like disorganized, they go on and say like, well, like most animals, dogs tend to find unpredictable environments stressful, what we've already been talking about. And it's possible that this gets into the fear of strangers piece. They say it's possible that the more pronounced fear of strangers displayed by these dogs in some way reflects the stress of living with their more disorganized owners. I guess. I don't know. I don't know the stranger fear one, truthfully, with just with low conscientiousness, with sort of a disorganized owner, except that again, maybe you just don't have someone like shepherding you through saying, hey, this is how this works. This is a stranger. We're fine. This is generally how these situations go, and you don't have anything to worry about.
And they're also just carrying around, I think, a higher baseline level of stress.
The dog. Yeah.
Right. So it's just like things that where other dogs, it just rolls off their back. Like, oh, that person was a little weird. Okay.
Right.
But like if you're already kind of, a little stressed because of your interactions with with the owner.
And you're picking up stressy vibes from your owners that may have nothing to do with the stranger.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And then last one, Podbersek and Serpel, this is 1997. I actually really like this. They highlight that even if the interpretation that, quote, anxious, tense, and neurotic owners sometimes cause their pets to become more aggressive or, quote unquote, badly behaved is accurate, the mechanism of this cause and effect relationship is really unclear.
Yeah.
And the authors go on to say that, like, based on existing research, we cannot say for sure, to your point earlier, whether like anxious or neurotic owners are more protective of their dogs. Maybe that's why they don't socialize them as much during early life. And then maybe the dogs are responding, or if it's something like, and that wouldn't be true if it was a rescue dog, right? But maybe it's something really benign, like, oh, I'm more anxious, and so I keep you close, so you just don't get exposed to as much, and so you're fearful, versus I'm doing something during interactions to make you fearful. It's just a lack of. I don't know.
Because
I don't know if I buy that, but
yeah.
But I like them raising that, like, or maybe it is that dogs are just responding to increased stress levels, to the owner's anxiety about life in general, which I think we brought up, that sort of like they're just carrying around a higher baseline, so maybe they're more likely to develop. So they are more likely to develop issues in specific areas.
Yeah.
And what do dogs develop issues about? Their owners, people, objects, other dogs, right? Like that's their world.
That's their world.
But I think it's nice to bring all that up. And then they say, or whether the owner's anxiety and less consistent behavior is creating increased conflict between the owner and dog. 100%, I would say. Or some combination of all of those. And it probably varies by case, So it's a great big, like, maybe this, maybe that. There's a lot of reasonable interpretations, I think. We don't really know.
No.
If we wanted to pull it all together and boil it down, I think the common threads we see are behavioral influence, right? Like our behaviors, which are going to be influenced by our personality traits, are going to affect how we interact with our dogs. And that's going to influence their behavior, right? So who we are influences how we behave, influences how our dogs behave. And the other one is emotional contagion. And that's a very real thing.
Yes.
We'll do a whole other episode, I think, on co-regulation, because I find that really interesting and fascinating and a great topic. But dogs have been shown to experience emotional contagion, right? That phenomenon where like emotions and the related behaviors can spread from one individual to another. And they can absolutely pick up on and mirror our emotional states. And those emotional states are often influenced by our personality traits.
Yeah.
So, that all seems reasonable to conclude. But I think from there, it's really easy to now be like, okay, well, great. I mean, I guess I just have a dog with behavior issues. And I think this is where it's really important to stop and acknowledge, like, we all have an influence on our dog's behavior, just like we all have an influence on any close relationship in our life because of who we are. But this is where it's really important to say, like, what does significant really mean?
Yeah.
Right? Because significant in academic research just means it's unlikely that we achieve these results by chance. These populations of anxious owners versus non-anxious owners are different to some degree. Right? To what degree? We'll dig in a little bit more and find out. And all that to say too, like, studies are never going to encapsulate everything about a relationship, right? We do the best we can. But if you're feeling right now like guilty or you're blaming yourself, like, please don't, because it's really important to actually look at the effect sizes of these studies.
Yeah.
And that means, like, how much of an impact, right? How much more likely is your dog to show aggressive behavior? So what's kind of interesting is that, at least in my reading of the studies, and someone's out there wants to correct me, I would love them to, or to bring me more information. But 3 of the 5 studies that we looked at, so Keese et al., Podbershek and Serpell, and Gobo and Zupan, from the published research, I wasn't able to parse out and figure out the degree to which owner personality traits actually impacted variances on dog behavior. It was reported that like there were significant results, but the effect sizes weren't shared in the published papers.
Okay.
So I don't know. So, and even I'll break that down a little bit more. So like, if this gets a little dry for people, I understand, but I think there probably would be a selection of people that would also like to know. For Gabo and Zupan, for instance, where owners with higher neuroticism scores were found to be significantly more likely to have dogs with human-directed aggression. What we could pull from the paper is this. Owners of human aggressive dogs and owners of non-aggressive dogs both had average neuroticism scores that fell within the moderate range of the Big Five scoring scale. Mm-hmm. The difference was owners of human aggressive dogs had a neuroticism score of 32.7, which is at the higher end of the moderate range, while owners of non-aggressive dogs averaged a neuroticism score of 25, which is at the lower end of the moderate range. So we could say, whether you have a human aggressive dog or a non-aggressive dog, you both fall in the moderate range of neuroticism for the Big Five.
Right.
Right? It's just, where are those cutoffs, and what does that mean in practical terms? I don't know. Right? But interesting. But then in the 2 remaining studies, they do have more insight about kind of what's the magnitude of that relationship, or what's the size of that relationship. So in Dodman, 2018, the authors said that while they found a lot of significant relationships between owner personality traits and the severity of different dog behaviors, most of those associations accounted for less than 10% of the variance in the dog's behavior. Okay. And then in Clark and Loftus 2023, the authors reported that while the relationships were statistically significant, owner traits like depression and anxiety explained only a small portion of the variance in dog behaviors, typically less than 10%, and most often accounting for only 3 to 5% of the variation in behavior frequencies between dogs. Now, 10% is not nothing. But it's also not 50% or 60% or 25% or 30%. You know, do you have thoughts on that? And does that land as surprising for you? Does it land as...
No, that makes sense. That makes sense to me, because I think when you read all these, it makes it sound like there's a huge, like, this is why this is happening. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, just, when I look at dogs that we work with, I think it's sort of like, if you have a dog who's kind of prone to these things, mm-hmm. and you tend to skew more on this end, mm-hmm. it kind of interacts that way. Like, I feel like, right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it sort of has to be, I feel like it's not like,
can be a tricky match.
It's like a tricky match. Cause I think there's lots of dogs where, whether they went with one owner on the high end of the scale or the low end of the scale, they'd be pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. Like, they wouldn't have these issues or whatever. Yeah. But you have those dogs that are they're kind of, it's a fine line for them, like, mm-hmm. in terms of like keeping things together and feeling confident, or like tipping over into these other behaviors, and just enough of like these other things will tip things over. So like, and I think it's also important to say too, like, there's so many people who, if you get like a rescue, you get a 3-year-old rescue dog who's leash reactive, like, it doesn't matter what your personality traits are going to be. Like,
put a pin in that as something you might want to work on later. Like, we'll talk about some of the things you can do, but like,
and it will be important to adopt certain ways of interacting with your dog, mm-hmm. to move those things forward. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, where people fall on that scale, what they naturally tend to do, is going to aid that or exacerbate it. And so I think for me, it's just like, again, I tend to think of it more like, oh, this is a tricky match. And like the two personality, like the personality of the dog and the personality of the owner, sometimes it's just like, oh, it can move a dog in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. And I think the other nice thing about that too is, again, there's lots in how, because again, it's not like your dog's not like reading your mind that you have these personality traits. It's behaviors that you're expressing and or showing or doing,
Mm-hmm.
and you have control over those things. So like largely have control. So like how you're interacting with your dog, how to make things predictable,
Mm-hmm.
how to do things. So in order to move, it's not like you're doomed to always interact with your dog that way.
Well, yeah, and I think what you're saying too is like, can dogs tell that we're stressed in a variety of ways, and potentially even by like how we smell and things like that? Like potentially,
Yeah,
probably,
probably.
yes. But is that the biggest piece that's influencing?
Right.
Most of the time, no.
Probably not.
You know, like there's other more overt things we can do with our behavior and interactions that are going to have a huge impact.
Yeah.
So I think for me I was kind of the same thing and remembering too that these are like, that doesn't, the other really important thing to remember is that a study that tells us something about a population tells us nothing about an individual relationship.
Correct.
And I think it's really important to remember that. Like, are there individual cases where an owner's behavior is having this, and I should say, where an owner's personality traits are having an outsized impact on a dog? Sure.
Yeah.
To your point, in like just a really unfortunate match.
Yes.
You know, like just a really unfortunate match.
Yeah.
But that's also not the norm.
No.
Right. So I think like,
and in many of these cases too, I even talking to owners, it's like if you had like any other random different dog and acted the same way, like unless you're like
yes,
outright, you're like, harassing your dog or, like really, like if you're just like doing normal things, you wouldn't have an issue. Like I think, and we've seen this
right.
where we've seen owners with multiple dogs. Like we've been open long enough now,
Yeah.
where we're in year 16, where we're seeing people on their second or third dog.
Yeah.
And, they're still the same people. And how it was with one puppy versus one rescue dog versus the new puppy is completely and utterly different.
Yeah.
So I think like that's something to keep in mind as well. It's again, to me, it really points back to if you have a dog with certain issues, then it's like, what can you focus on?
If you have a dog who's especially sensitive to stress, if maybe they also live in a stressful environment, if maybe they also have health issues, if maybe right. But I think what tends to happen too, I think, is that why this persists as being that it's like has such a big influence. One is I think we tie it a lot to what we really mean when we're saying that is like you behave anxiously, quotes, around your dog. And so they're anxious. And I do think our behavior does have a big influence on how our dogs behave in daily life, right?
Yes,
like that,
absolutely.
like it does. But just straight up, I'm anxious, so my dog's anxious. Like, no, it has an influence. I think one of the biggest reasons that this like persists, right, as something that we believe, and I think most of the time what we're talking about really is that we believe that someone's behavior has a big influence on their dog's behavior, and it does. It's not the only influence, but it is a big influence. But just straight up who you are as like, I'm anxious and therefore my dog is anxious, I think that's a much smaller impact, and it seems like the research bears that out as well. I think why this persists though is like confirmation bias, right? Like when we see a really anxious dog or who has a really anxious owner, we say, makes sense. Right. All those other anxious dogs who have like owners who aren't so visibly anxious, like, oh, that dog must have had a rough start to life, or that dog just must naturally, their biology must make them really prone to stress, and they're blah, 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 right? Like we automatically assign other reasons. But because we have this internal belief that like anxious dog, anxious owner, when we see it, those just raise to the surface and we say like, look, it happened again.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I'm sure you do this too. Because even, I have owners tell me like, I'm really anxious about this behavior or whatever. Or if I notice they're like a little anxious, like in the consult about what they're talking about, really what we do is just look at their behavior anyways. Like,
totally,
you know what I mean? So like I literally was working with someone recently who said like they were really anxious about like their separation anxiety and what they were doing. I was like, okay, like we start going through stuff and they're actually very confident in their handling, really like good. And then just a few little adjustments, they went so far. But like, so for me, like I didn't think his anxiety was really impacting anything. Because,
Sure.
you know
And
what
I'm
I
not
mean?
saying you specifically.
No, I know, but I think it's important because most people haven't had the opportunity to work with
Mhm.
thousands of dogs and
Yeah.
owners, and I think it's important, like, so people know, like, experience behavior, because a lot of times what we're looking at is like, oh, you feel anxious,
Right.
and then it's like, okay, well, like, how are the interactions going?
Right.
Because if you feel anxious and your interactions are good and we just need some tweaks, like, that's different.
Yeah.
And if there is behaviors that's like, okay, like, you are really, like, you're showing a lot of anxiety in your behaviors and things,
Right.
then we definitely need to adjust that. But I think for me, it's important for people to realize, even when we're working with them,
Mhm.
if someone tells me that they're anxious, I'm not going to immediately jump to, that's why your dog has that.
Oh, no, same.
You know what I
Sorry, I
mean?
didn't mean to suggest that, but I think as a collective, a big we.
Agreed. I was
Yeah.
just making
I'm glad
sure
you
people
clarified that.
listening,
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
like, when you go see a
Yeah.
professional, we won't think that way, or we shouldn't.
We won't. I do think that even among, and actually we have a blog on this too. There are articles, like when even one of the most recent study came out, that like some very well-known professional like are quick to say like, oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And they're not wrong. It's just like, but to what degree though? Because I think you might be overestimating it.
Yes.
And I'm not throwing them under the bus, like, again, but I do think just confirmation bias is a powerful thing.
It definitely is.
Yeah. But no, I'm glad you're clarifying, like like small we.
Yeah, right.
No. And like I think I would say like most instinct we.
Yeah.
And lots of other trainers also we, right? Like won't feel that. But and yeah. So anyway, like, I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be like if you work with a trainer, it's like, oh yeah, your dog's like this because of you.
Oh, find a new one.
Yeah. Right? But if it's one piece of a larger puzzle,
yeah,
then I think it is worth talking about. And then it's sort of like, again, what can I do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not because like, one thing you can say, oh, you're anxious, but like someone can't just say, just stop being anxious.
No.
Right? Like,
no.
That's not a.
Yeah. And also, if they're only focusing on what you're doing, right? Like if they're not also being like, let's look at your dog's environment, let's look at their health, let's look at what skills they know, like all that kind of stuff, then I mean, it's a bit of a red flag.
Yeah.
But so we have concluded that yes, it has some impact. Overall, it seems to be relatively small, but also not nothing, right? It's like a one piece of a much bigger puzzle. So what do we do about it? Like, what do people do about it? And I think we started to talk through that a lot with like, what does this actually mean? Mm-hmm. And I do think that that's sort of like focusing on how's that actually manifesting into behaviors, and what do we do about it? And I think the big one is, we mentioned it before, but like prioritizing predictability.
Yes.
With your dog. You might have to write these down, like whatever works for you, but things like making really simple routines, even for your dog, right? Like we go out the door the same way every time. Does it matter in the dog's world that they go out the door the same way every time, like every dog? No, but in the context of their relationship with you,
right,
and how you and your dog go out the door, that can be really meaningful.
Yes.
If you're having issues. If you're not, like, you're fine, but it's something, if you think, if this episode speaks to you as like, I feel like I might be, I'm an anxious person, or I'm, then like, it's a simple piece of low-hanging fruit to do. Start adding in routines. They don't have to be rigid, right? But like I give you dinner the same way every time. We go out the door the same way every time. We stop at curbs and I tell you you're a good doggy and give you a treat. You know what I mean? Like or you ask them to sit, like whatever, but little simple routines can be huge. And then also, and I know you'll have lots to say this too, but like set some boundaries. Right? Because you already kind of probably have some in your head, but maybe you're not consistent about them. Right? Or people are sometimes not consistent about them. And I think that can be a big source of stress for dogs. And maybe if you're dealing with your own anxiety, you're just not always, if you're really stressed about something or you're feeling really, really anxious, like, maybe it's just a little harder to remember what the boundary was. So like set them out, write them down. It doesn't have to be a ton of them, but like pick 3 boundaries in your home that you want to stick to and be super consistent about them. And that helps with predictability and just overall, I think, relationship dynamics of like, oh, this person is like watching out for me. They always do the same thing. They let me know what I can do. They let me know what I'm not allowed to do in a kind way. I think those go a long way.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And sometimes too, like if people say like, well, what boundaries do I set? Like it's usually easy to start in your home because especially if you have a dog with issues, trying to set boundaries around the things they have issues with and stuff that's going to come later. But like what are what are 1, 2, or 3 things that your dog is not allowed to do in your home? Like, and I know a lot of times we talk about because we wanted, but like, it can be as simple as when I make dinner, you're on your mat. Or when I make dinner, you stay out of the kitchen.
Yeah.
Or you're not allowed up on this chair or this couch, or if and like just
you're not allowed to come with me to the bathroom.
Right.
Like,
so I'm not talking about anything crazy.
No.
But super, super consistent. And this is where it gets anecdotal. So there's no research on if you keep your dog out of the bathroom when you go in, like it's going to, but I think.
But it's not about the bathroom.
It's not. It's
right.
No, it's not. It's, for me, anecdotally, people who tend to have a few boundaries, their dogs just tend to be, by and large, their relationship with their dog is more relaxed, and their dog will kind of defer to them or look to them for guidance or do different things. That just establishes something in the relationship, and picking something that's nice and easy to set a boundary on, something that's fair, something that they can do. And I think the other part of that too is like how we respond when enforcing those boundaries, and also how we respond when they're doing those problem behaviors. Because I think that's the other big thing is sort of like, and that's where a behavior consultant can help. But it's like, how do I respond to these things? Because obviously, especially when you're trying to make things better, it's really important. Like, how do I respond to these things consistently without adding more anxiety, without adding more stress, and that it is consistent, so at least the dog knows what's going to happen.
Right.
And that's not going to magically fix anything. But I do think that's a major component, because if we handle that a different way, and especially when emotions are high, I do find that can really just...
Yeah. If you're adding sort of emotional volatility or like just emotional energy.
And that anticipation of like what's going to happen next, it can really ramp up really quickly.
Yeah.
So.
And what I would say is, I think just like with dogs, where a lot of times we're saying like, if you're really anxious or worried or something in a certain situation, it usually can speak to some kind of skill deficit, right? Like you don't know how to handle this situation well. Not always, but often.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the same thing can be like if you're trying to work with a trainer or a behavior consultant and you're like getting into, okay, what do I actually do when X happens or when Y happens? Get really specific about it, right? Hold your leash this way, stand with your back like this, be X feet away. Like, I know that sounds silly, but like build specific skills and just think of them as skills. Like, don't think about like, I'm
100%
embodying, I'm not anxious. Like that won't work. Just be like, oh, it's happening. Shit, I'm really anxious. Okay, I got to keep my back straight. Okay, don't like keep my eyes on him, but don't stare.
Yeah.
Create
space.
Yeah, exactly. Back up 2 feet or what, I'm not saying that's like the thing to do, but like have specific, build skills of what to do in those moments. And that's like skill building is another one, a skill building for the person.
Yeah. And I would also add on top of that, I do think if you are a person who tends to talk to your dog a lot, I think the other thing is getting used to sort of like, kind of asking once and having some patience. Or if you ask and it doesn't happen, create some space so maybe that they can do it. Ask again. But like really like the commentary.
Yeah.
I find really, at least for me.
Especially directive commentary, though. I think it's important to say that too. I mean, I would agree with you. I think if you talk a lot, that's like probably not
and a lot of
great.
Like the sit.
Yes, 100%.
Like the
like directive stuff.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I do find that particularly detrimental to progress.
And that's not, I just want to clarify too. It's not the like, oh, only ask once and make them do it. No. It's like ask in a way that actually gives them time to process.
Yes.
And that makes you feel like, yes, this is an important thing that we have to work through right now, but like, I'm not frantic about it.
Yeah.
We're just going to make it happen. Like, I'll help you if I need to.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would also add too, I think it's really important that, if you have a dog with specific issues, like let's say leash reactivity, like that's an easy one. Like if you're having a particularly bad day, cut the walk short.
Right? Yes.
Because like it is going to take some extra thought and self-control and those types of things. So if you know, like, if that's something you're working on, you're having a particularly anxious day, I do think sometimes those days it's like, I'm not going to fight those battles today.
Yeah, you can be like, we go on long walks when I'm at like less than a 5.
Yep.
And or 6 or whatever. If I'm at a 7 or above, we're going to pee and we're coming back in,
and
like, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think I really like that a lot. And then I know this is a simple one, but I think it's also important is like when you're kind of bogged down in issues and you're trying to work on your own behavior and predictability and all that kind of stuff, like also just focus on positive interactions. Like make a list in your head or on your notes app or wherever you want of like all the things that your dog does that actually bring you joy or peace, right? Just like, I love it when he's like asleep on the couch and he takes that big breath of a sigh out, and like notice when those things happen, or also do more of the things that actually bring you both joy or make you both feel peaceful, right? Like, oh, we really are at our best when we're on an early morning walk or whatever, and do more of them. And I am just going to say this because it's a whole episode, but like ideally choose training approaches that sort of reinforce what it is that you're trying to do. Focus on approaching your dog in a kind way, emphasize social connection. If you're using stuff that's maybe more focused on like inhibiting behavior, then the reality is that there's also research to show that those types of techniques can increase things like aggression or can lead to increased instances of aggressive behavior. So if we're looking for ways to pare back and say, how do I reduce the likelihood? That's one thing to just be aware of.
Yeah.
And that's a much bigger topic. And if you're doing what you're doing, like you can only focus on so much at once.
Yeah.
So, and then I think the only other couple things I would say is like, if you're not super, super familiar with dog body language and some of the more subtle stuff, learn about it. I really like, this is not like a sponsorship or anything. I really like Lily Chin's book, Doggy Language. It's great. It has a lot of like more subtle stuff in there that you just do not automatically know, and it's not intuitive. And then it lets you actually be in on the conversation that your dog is trying to have with you.
Yeah. And it's super cute and easy to read.
It is. Yeah. If you have kids, they'll like it too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's great for them. And then like, don't try to do it all by yourself. If you have a dog with issues, like whether you feel like you tend towards a more anxious personality or not, like it's hard,
Yep.
So you can find good online groups. You can find other dog owners who are kind of having similar issues, and you can celebrate wins together, do a little venting, but don't spin on it for too long. But I think like trying to do it all by yourself and is hard. So find someone that's a cheerleader, but also that will listen when you're having a bad day and not be too quick to try to rush you on from that. And yeah, I think that's everything. Yeah. Hopefully the research part wasn't too dry for people. I find it really interesting, but I know sometimes translating that into listening to someone talk through stuff can be a little dry, but hopefully it was informative.
Yeah. Like be aware of it. It's not the be all end all.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
And there's lots of things you can do about it too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, this was fun. Nice to get back into the swing of things. I think we're a little bit rusty, but we'll shake it off. And lots more good topics coming up. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.
Bye.